Well, I want to thank everyone for braving the rain. I didn't recognize it at first when it started falling, but then I remembered that we have had such a thing. I'm Rick Wilson. I'm the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today's Scientia lecture on the topic of privacy. Before beginning, I want to point out that this year's DeLange Conference on Humans, Machines, and the Future of Work will be held December 5th through 6th during Dead Week. And it's going to focus on the impact of information technology on labor markets in the near and distant future. You might think of the topic as one of what's labor going to mean once the robots take over? Personally, I've given up on my dream of being a long-haul truck driver on retirement, because I think when I retire, the future is going to be of a driverless society, at least for the long haul. So please take a visit delange.rice.edu or check out Sciencia's website, and you can get pointed to DeLange. Feel free to register for the conference. It's going to prove to be very interesting. Now, to return to the Scientia lectures, this year's topic is privacy. We live in an age where little of what we do is kept private. When we surf the web, the sites we visit, the time we spend viewing the pages, and what we click on next are all logged and sometimes used for commercial or other purposes. Depending on where we live, our movement throughout the day is tracked by our GPS coordinates, tracked by surveillance cameras, tracked by countless cell phone cameras. Nobody's taking pictures here, but we're recorded on video, so great. Our financial and health records are also held on servers that are sometimes breached. Occasionally, even presidential candidates' servers are breached, and that information is no longer private. So, in short, you might wonder, where is privacy? And Sciencia's colloquium series for this year is looking at privacy from multiple perspectives. And today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Scott Colman, who's an assistant professor in the School of Architecture, talking about Prisonship Earth. Dr. Colman is an architectural historian, theorist, critic, and designer who specializes in modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism. His research develops a conceptual framework for understanding the relationship between ideas and design. Dr. Colman has degrees in architecture from the Knowlton School of Architecture, the Ohio State University, and the University of Sydney, where he completed his PhD. He's worked as a project architect in Australia and the United States, lectured at many different conferences and symposia globally, and has been an invited design critic at numerous institutions in the US and internationally. So I'm looking forward to his talk. It seems propitious in this time of questioning our privacy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Colman. Scott?
Okay. Cooking with gas. All right. So I wanted to thank Professor Wilson and the Scientia Committee for inviting me to speak today, and Scientia and Michelle Deppenbrock for organising the series. Okay, so the series, as I understand it, concerns privacy, and in particular the loss of privacy due to the pervasive and automatic surveillance allowed by contemporary information technologies. Given the topic, to which before I haven't given much specific attention, and the interdisciplinary format, I speak with a certain personal and disciplinary self-consciousness. For those reasons, it's perhaps a little more important to wander out onto a limb, or perhaps better stated, walk the plank. So I'm going to offer a draft sketch, painted with the broadest of brushes, of the historical relationship between architecture and surveillance, and then speculate rather wildly and vaguely, I want to stress, on how we as architects might recognise the pickle we're in and pull ourselves out of the brine. With respect to the question of surveillance and architecture, the obvious place to me to begin is the prison. The prison is a space, one might suggest, in which all manner of private activity becomes a matter of public concern. And so to preface where I'm headed, the modern prison, a space of confinement and unrelenting observation, seems peculiarly pertinent today. Our unfolding environmental catastrophe suggests all manner of private activity is becoming a matter of public concern. And our digital visibility, from the global to the personal, seems totalizing. Hence the rather dire title. But while I don't think it's at all possible to escape either of these conditions, we have no more chance of abandoning the planet or escaping technologies of surveillance, personalised and global, than we do of winding back the Anthropocene, I'm not as pessimistic as may first appear. As you can perhaps tell from my accent, perhaps even from my behaviour sometimes, I was born in what used to be a prison. So prisons are, at least in some circumstances, open to change. And at the same time as Australia was being invaded and transformed into a penal colony, as the island's isolation was being used by the British overlords to construct a tyranny of distance, the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham was setting out his idea for the Panopticon. Bentham thought dispensing punishment was an act of evil, but one that could be justified according to his utilitarian philosophy, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. If the minimum degree of punishment could be leveraged to obtain the maximum degree of deterrent. So to manage this, Bentham proposed an ingenious instrument. The Panopticon placed prisoners in individual cells arranged around an observation post, which could house a warden. And from his position at the centre of this arrangement, the warden could observe the activities of the prisoners. But due to the design of the observation post, the warden remained unseen and could come and go without the prisoner's knowledge. The incarcerated, imagining the existence of an omnipresent overseer, never sure when they were being watched, moderated their activity accordingly. Bentham advised that the arrival of the convicted to the prison should be a public spectacle, that the public should be invited into the prison to witness its operation, and for public exposition, he imagined the outer wall might be constructed entirely of glass. In Bentham's scheme, the fiction of the omnipotent eye disciplined the prisoner, while the hearsay of the ongoing confinement disciplined the community. Through the design of an efficient theatre of surveillance, Bentham conceived a socio-architectural machine by which both the guilty and the innocent would effectively police themselves. It is interesting to consider the so-called Snowden affair in the light of Bentham's architectural theory. Only insofar as the techniques of the observer were revealed to the prisoner was the capacity to surveil retarded. Rather, insofar as revelations of surveillance confirm the fact of surveillance, they realise and enhance the spectre of surveillance. And so while Snowden's revelations may portend tighter democratic oversight, Bentham would surely say that Snowden's disclosures also had the effect of deepening and entrenching self-censorship. It was precisely this, the way in which the spectre of observation affects performance, the way it inculcates model behaviours, that led Bentham to suggest the Panopticon idea was applicable to schools, asylums, hospitals, and other institutions. While none were built as Bentham proposed, the model of isolation and observation, both radial and otherwise, became the basic trope of an institutional architecture. In Discipline and Punish, the French philosopher Michel Foucault suggested the dual aspects of Bentham's Panopticon, isolation and inspection, exemplary of the instrumental power of modern societies. An application of the methods of the natural sciences to the social sciences, enlightened institutions of all kinds, private and public, divide and classify the social body into categories such that workers of various skills and classes, the insane, the sick, the criminal, the ignorant, are reformed, disciplined, trained, inculcated with values and behaviours. Moreover, this isolation and evaluation of performance constitutes a mechanism of research, by which means and methods of social control are tested, information gathered, processed and disseminated, feeding back into the system. In the large-scale urban reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries, it's possible to argue that this apportionment and parcelling, inspection and training of the social body was extended beyond the walls of the institution into the city, insofar as the great planning schemes of the 19th and 20th centuries sought to clarify, order and distribute the social body, to house the different classes, spatially delimit and arrange urban activities, and stage social conduct under the common gaze. The architect-planner was an instrument of social control. At the onset of Napoleon III's great renovation of Paris, Charles Baudelaire, in his Les Fleurs du Mal, his Flowers of Evil, drew the attention of the police. Baudelaire was guilty of upturning but not condemning the urban underbelly, its morbid and immoral desires and social detritus, prostitution and poverty, then being displaced and cleared. The great boulevards of Paris cast a purifying light on the inhabitants of the crumbling medieval city. This great act of bourgeois gentrification, subsequently rehearsed in cities around the globe and arguably still at work in today's globalizing cities, produced that public space promoted in the art of La Belle Époque and by many still celebrated today. These deliberate acts of publication constructed the space of appearance, the space of reciprocal communication, our public sphere, over and against the invisibility, the privacy of the bourgeois interior. In effect, Baudelaire was censored for being witness to the murder of an older city. The dense, dank, chaotic, and putrid slums of the recently industrialized cities were understood as threatening cesspools of disease. But they were also understood as threats to social control. The political fermentation in these places was as potentially incendiary as their fire-prone building stock. The impenetrable interiors of these urban underworlds, rabbit warrens of escape routes, were incomprehensible to authority. Upright Victorians descending into the depths with their patronising views described the poverty and the stench, the labyrinthine mazes, the overcrowded and decaying buildings. Unstable, ad hoc, and misused buildings embodied the unlawfulness. In certain areas of London, the mansions of once proud, long-deceased estates had been occupied, and in the vivid descriptions of one commentator, appeared eaten through by worms. Discovering a world in which doorways were left open to the street, walls had been knocked out, multiple connections opened rooms onto rooms onto rooms, the indignant moralists were aghast at the utter lack of privacy. Bathing, cooking, eating, defecating, copulating took place apparently indiscriminately, in ambiguous zones, in the presence of children and strangers. The definition of space, of who belonged to whom, where social relationships ended and began, the sanctity of property, the contours of responsibility, all appeared shockingly absent. Against this unending and threatening porosity, boulevards a la Haussmann establish a clear hierarchy of urban corridors. In effect, they projected into the urban realm the spatial organisation of the bourgeois interior. Unlike the enfilade organisation of earlier Renaissance interiors at the left, in which rooms via multiple communications open directly onto other rooms, the bourgeois domestic interior at right arranges rooms directly off corridors in the name of privacy. Private space is separated from public circulation, which is to say the contours of private and public space are formalised and in effect naturalised by design. Invested with social significance and habitual behaviour, architecture's capacity to organise the visual field and erect limitations on movement perpetuates social relationships. But more than perpetuate social relationships, the philanthropic mind sought to extend and construct social relationships through architecture. For example, in his model houses for 4 families, erected in conjunction with the Great Exhibition in London in 1951, Henry Roberts offered an architecture of bourgeois moral clarity to reform what he thought were the appalling living conditions of the proletariat. But he also took the opportunity to reform what he thought were the appalling living arrangements of the working class. The model separated dwelling units, and thus families, by the use of an open exterior staircase. It provided visual privacy between interior and exterior spaces, emphasising the threshold between public and private. And it isolated functions and clarified social relationships and practices within the dwelling. It provided 2 bedrooms for children, located off the living area and thus open to constant inspection, and a more private bedroom for the activities of the parents out of view of the children. Such it is that the privacy we today hold so dearly, within and between our dwellings, might be understood to be always already imbricated with a public dimension. The progressive proposals of late 19th century reformers, like the one we've just seen, formed the foundation of modern architecture's unprecedented engagement with questions of housing. In the Paris of Haussmann, the interests of the bourgeoisie were at issue, but in the Paris of Le Corbusier, the threat of the proletariat became salient. In his 1923 book, Vers on Architecture, Toward an Architecture, Le Corbusier was explicit about the role of housing in the functioning of society as a whole. Le Corbusier saw the modernisation of housing as essential to the stability of society. A new and improved standard of dwelling would ensure the integrity of the family and thus social stability. He suggested the working masses, aware of the great technologies of the day, grew restless with their substandard conditions. He argued the provision of functional, mass-produced housing provided adequate space and amenity, light, air, and nature for recreation, could prevent the kind of uprising seen in Russia only 6 years before. And by providing order, adequate shelter, and facilities for rest and recreation, what Le Corbusier called machines for living in would manufacture a replenished pool of labour for industry. In Le Corbusier's famous conclusion, architecture or revolution, revolution can be avoided, the intersection of architecture and social control couldn't have been made more explicit. When seen through the lens of social control, the architecture of good intentions loses its rose-coloured hue. But I want to stress that the understanding modern architecture as a mechanism of social control blinds us from seeing its ongoing value. It's perhaps all the more necessary then to recall that there was more to urban reform than assigning everyone and their activities a place. Central to the modern movement was a broadly shared aim to overcome the spatial and material inequalities extant between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Conceiving a mass subject to whom a basic standard of amenity would be provided, modern architects and urbanists imagined a subsistence dwelling with adequate services, space, light, air, and facilities for recreation and social support, such as childcare, furnished with a staple of affordable, mass-produced, quality material goods, and organised in relationship with the landscape to allow easy access to the workplace and a metropolitan culture. In short, modern architecture and urbanism sought the provision of a right to housing and the right to a modern lifestyle, akin to the right to education, healthcare, and a living wage. For modern architect-urbanists, the control of environmental production was fundamental. But in the context of the modern social housing projects and the broad cultural and generational changes of the post-war period, it's not too much of an exaggeration to suggest the spectre of social control came to dominate our reception of modern architecture and urbanism. For those on the left, such as Henri Lefebvre and the Situationists, modern architecture's complicity with the state in constructing the urban space of appearance was patronising, deterministic, and constricting. For those on the right, such as Jane Jacobs, who, fearful of crime and social unrest, sought return to the 19th century street in the name of surveillance, modern architecture had abrogated its duty of social control. The question of modern architecture's role in the instrumentalisation of social control, be it capitalist, state-sponsored, or the combination of the two, has remained a subject of disciplinary hand-wringing ever since. Okay, so now everything I've said to this point was very apparent to architectural thinkers half a century ago. These issues were central to the tumult of architectural discourse that came with the political tumult of the 60s. But more specifically, with few exceptions, everything I've said to this point can be interpolated from a few essays written in the 1970s by a young professor at the Architectural Association in London. In an essay of 1971, Robin Evans, having read Foucault's 1961 Madness and Civilization in the French, interrogated Bentham's Panopticon 5 years before Foucault discussed Bentham in Discipline and Punish. In a text in the same year, Towards an Architecture, a play on Le Corbusier's book title, and in the context of the radical architectural experiments that sought to invest architecture with a greater participatory capacity, a reference to anarchism, Evans questioned the functionalist discourse that assigned activities to spaces, but also the paradoxical notion that architecture could accommodate absolute spatial freedom. But of particular importance, I want to suggest, to the subsequent course of architectural thought was an essay on the wall that Evans published in June 1971. Evans' essay was an encapsulation and an inversion of the prevailing discourse. Certainly, the wall could be used as an instrument to impose confinement, he argued, but it could also be a protective layer that, drawn around oneself, provides a means of retreat. Evans' primary example was the character Jean des Esseintes from Joris Karl Huysmans' late 19th century novel A Rebours, variably translated in English as Against Nature or Against the Grain. In his effort to exclude himself from the mundane and distasteful social interactions of contemporary society and cocoon himself within his own private desires and pleasures, Evans noted that Huysmans' protagonist moved himself out of the centre of Paris to the remote and deserted suburbs. But self-imposed isolation is not always so individualistic, Evans noted. It has also been sought for entire societies. He pointed out that the emperor that initiates construction of the Great Wall of China, designed unsuccessfully, it should be stressed, to protect the nation from invasion, also decreed the burning of any books not devoted to the pragmatic arts. In the context of self-imposed isolation, Evans concluded, the wall is a mechanism of censorship, a deliberate exclusion of information. Recent political debates might suggest it's worth dwelling on this point for just a moment. If we suppose the private precedes the public, then we take privacy to be a kind of neutral independence. But if we suppose the private arises with the public, then the presumption of privacy is premised on the exclusion of public correspondence. In this regard, it's worth mentioning a footnote that from Bentham's design of the Panopticon. In a revision of his proposal, Bentham found himself eliminating a scheme that he had to run acoustic metal tubes through the walls of the building. While these tubes would have allowed the warden to eavesdrop and verbally command the prisoners at a distance, they would also have unintentionally allowed the prisoners acoustic access to the warden. This symmetry was incompatible with the intention of surveillance. As Foucault put it in Discipline and Punish, in the Panopticon, the prisoner is, quote, the object of information, never a subject of communication. If the public sphere, founded in our mutual embodied appearance in space, is premised on mutual communication, it is precisely this reciprocity that is eliminated in the act of surveillance and the act of private retreat. And therefore, rather than some natural condition, self-imposed isolation, the withdrawal into personal or shared enclaves with exclusive worldviews, is conceivable as the inverse of surveillance. Both retreat and surveillance concern the deliberate filtering, the designed asymmetry of information. Which is to say, while we might suppose, as the premise of this lecture series does, that surveillance is a threat to privacy, it is really, or at least also, in fact, the public sphere that is undermined by both an excessive surveillance and an excessive privacy. Excessive surveillance and excessive privacy both produce a sustained asymmetric control of information, eroding the mutual correspondence, the communication essential to the public sphere. Which leads me to why I think Evans on the essay on the wall was pivotal in the subsequent course of architectural discourse. Read with his essay on the Panopticon, Evans understood the wall as a mechanism of confinement and a mechanism of exclusion, and thus established the terms for the architectural theory that followed. The wall would soon be conceived otherwise. Rather than a mechanism of confinement or exclusion, the wall could be understood as a mechanism of inclusion. 2 months after Evans published his essay on the wall, Rem Koolhaas, who, if you're not an architect, you may know as one of the speakers at the Rice Centennial a couple of years ago, then a student at the Architectural Association where Evans taught, found himself in Berlin on a trip that coincided with the 10th anniversary of the Berlin Wall. In a later memorandum written around the time of Evans' premature death in 1993, but inexplicably, I think, not mentioning Evans, Koolhaas recalled his realization that the wall surrounding West Berlin, quote, encircles the city, paradoxically making it free. And in the following year, the year following his Berlin visit, Koolhaas presented his graduation project, Exodus or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. The project was a fiction, which began with a thinly veiled tale of the wall in Berlin. When the good half of the city began to attract immigrants from the bad half, and efforts to stem the flow failed, the authorities enclosed the good half within a wall. Koolhaas flipped the script of the events in Berlin. Inscribed on London, Koolhaas's walls were not for stemming an exodus, but for encouraging one. Within Koolhaas's heterotopic prison, voluntary prisoners would be ecstatic in the freedom of their architectural confines. Koolhaas conceived a strip of, quote, a strip of intense metropolitan desirability, end quote, in which architecture produces pleasure in bondage and becomes, quote, the hedonistic science of designing collective facilities that fully accommodate individual desires. Drawing on the social condensers of the Soviet avant-garde, Koolhaas's project employed a menu of architectural technologies and spaces designed for the stimulation of the senses: hallucinogenic air conditioning, paradisical images, wave machines, art studios, grottos, memory palaces, hedonistic baths, festive hospitals, and erotic cures. In short, Bentham's Panopticon had been inverted. The institution of architecture could script fictions as optimistic as pessimistic. If architecture could inculcate negative prescriptions, it could also project positive aspirations. Tellingly, Koolhaas imagined his voluntary prisoners reciting an ode, drawn from the first stanza of Baudelaire's Parisian Dream, from the Parisian scene section of La Fleur de Mal. An architectural fantasy of a pleasure palace, from which the sleeper wakes to their wretched reality. Baudelaire's fantasy was a purely artificial world, a Babel of modern technology, a crystal palace of, quote, endless stairs, arcades, pools, and bright cascades, end quote. And then 5 years later, drawing, it seems to me, on the psychological arguments at play in the Passion and Delirium section of Foucault's Madness and Civilization, Koolhaas publishes Delirious New York, in which the technologies of the metropolis, such as the skyscraper, are presented as mechanisms for fabricating collective fantasies and desires, and the role of architecture becomes the procreation of hitherto unforeseen worlds. In a cartoon from the popular press, which he dubbed the 1909 Theorem, Koolhaas divined the surreal logic of the metropolis. Taking up the elevator and the steel frame, skyscraper architecture maximizes its liberation from an inherited plot. The skyscraper multiplies the earth, proliferates an otherwise singular claim into multiple stories, and thus allows manifold fictions, manifold lifestyles, to coexist with minimal bearing on the earth's surface. Koolhaas asserted the 1931 Downtown Athletic Club in New York rendered the 1909 theorem concrete. Hidden behind the building's mute facade, he discovered a surreal taxonomy of uses, unhindered by preoccupation. The club's diverse section facilitated a vertical coincidence of programs, a layering of manifold experiences: gymnasia, dining, bathing, massaging, swimming, golfing, parklands. Koolhaas summarized this hedonistic world, brutal and erotic, with a sketch and a caption, quote, eating oysters with boxing gloves, naked on the nth floor, end quote. The skyscraper embodied Bourget's Chinese encyclopedia, indexed by an elevator. Given the demonstrable independence of architecture and function, Koolhaas cast the skyscraper as a kind of metropolitan infrastructure in which varying scenarios are accommodated, played out, developed, tested, replaced over time. The skyscraper was a film script, the elevator a jump cut between wildly differing scenes. Hitherto untheorized as an architectural condition, Koolhaas argued, the skyscraper, quote, invalidates all the previous systems of articulation and differentiation, which, to say the wall, that have traditionally guided the design of cities. Neither confinement nor exclusion, metropolitan architecture is a threshold of attractions. The concept of architecture as a means of producing alternate worlds has become a leitmotif of advanced architectural practice in the ensuing decades. Through the interrogation of architecture's internal processes, its procedures, representations, diagrams, and theoretical frameworks, speculative architectural practice has perhaps never been more capable of, nor committed to, producing an expansive range of architectural qualities, fabricating sensibilities for the cultivation of selective appetites. At one point, I had supposed the lecture could be a smorgasbord of these kinds of projects, in particular those that carefully stage our visibility and curate social interaction to produce particularly urban ambiances. For example, this hotel by Jean Nouvel, which opened at the turn of the millennium in Lucerne, constructs a condition in which the everyday theatre of seeing and being seen intermixes with a cloud of mediated images. Through the inventive apertures shown in the section here, Nouvel invents the capacity to displace space, confusing our perception of the relationship between interior and exterior. The film stills on the ceiling of the guest rooms and the mirrors that allow reciprocal views between the basement and the street imbricate the urban, the private dream world of the hotel, and our cinematographic memory palace. But works such as this primarily concern the artistic and cultural aspects of architecture. Insofar as they set up moments of surveillance, they do so within an abbreviated time frame. They quickly betray any asymmetric power relations. The subject of the gaze soon becomes the observer or vice versa. Information quickly becomes communication, and thus these kinds of projects use this reciprocity to stage cultural representations, moments of hedonistic theatricality within a space of mutual appearance. But with digital surveillance, we face an entirely other condition, a regime that is pervasive, invisible, unending, and unceasing. And this regime, it seems to me, concerns not architectural work per se, but the way in which architecture always embodies within it even when it is a denial of the metropolitan and urban, which is to say socio-political conception. And it is this urban dimension, the coordination and mutual sustainability of our manifold desires that we have, in the wake of the modern movement, I would argue, failed to adequately manage. In our quest for the production of alternate worlds, for the proliferation of genres and the liberty of difference, we have, to a concerning degree, neglected the fundamental logic implicit in Koolhaas's argument. Privacy, be it collective or individualistic, is unsustainable without density. The proliferation of architectural fantasies without a complementary urban strategy allowing their coexistence drains our cities of collective value, and an architecture of attraction becomes an architecture of isolation and retreat. Even our once great metropoli are being suburbanised. As the centre of our cities are being staked out as parking lots for capital, as overinflated interiors balloon in, urban vibrancy is punctured and the help is displaced. In this sense, the current global housing crisis differs from the housing emergencies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In certain places and in certain situations, certainly, housing remains a question of health and safety and the provision of adequate physical amenity. But unlike earlier crises, standards of housing are little discussed. Established and exorbitant norms are largely accepted, and the question of access becomes paramount. Lack of access to housing equals lack of access to the most productive job markets, and insofar as the ecologies of our inner cities remain the richest, to the most abundant cultural fruits of contemporary society. Yet even more pressing are the ecological consequences of a current wave of rapid urbanisation. Increased density drastically reduces our carbon footprint. How we organise our cities to accommodate the expected urban growth, an additional 2 billion people in the next 20 years alone, will determine the environment of the planet and our collective future. In many ways, the legacy of architecture's historical engagement with social control hinders our capacity to address these questions. For nearly half a century, architects have been paralysed, caught between conflicting accusations of tyranny and impotence. As a consequence, architectural discourse has consolidated around the trope of agency, a convenient term for evoking efficacy without determinism. Our dawning acknowledgement of the Anthropocene should leave little doubt about our environmental agency. The cumulative effects of our individual actions are becoming everywhere apparent. But this growing understanding also makes obvious the very large gap between agency and control, between environmental agency and environmental control. That social control is premised on environmental control was never in doubt for modern architects, social scientists, and many others. Yet with architecture's loss of confidence in and commitment to its social function, it also withdrew its responsibility for comprehensive and egalitarian environmental planning. And now the threats we face from our neglect of coordinated environmental planning, and thus our unwitting and flagrantly willful modulation of environmental processes, carries real and imminent socio-political consequences. With an apology for the cringeworthiness of what I'm about to say, well might we re-articulate Le Corbusier's famous phrase and say, environment or revolution, revolution can be avoided. I think I might have heard that somewhere else, I don't know, anyway. Okay, it seems to me, rather surprisingly, I must admit, that surveillance actually provides something of a cure for architecture's half-century of guilt. The architectural strategies of ordered isolation central to social control in the 19th and the 20th centuries have been usurped by our contemporary technologies for tracking and identification. Isolation and unremitting observation are no longer focused by architectural and urban lenses. Our intentions are tracked and anticipated by chips and software. Surveillance is honed to the body. It is not our address that fixes us in space, but our devices. And if we accept that social control is no longer a function of architecture, the discipline of architecture might cast off the burden of surveillance for good. And lifted of the burden of social control, we might glimpse modern architecture anew. Rather than focusing on modern architecture's apparently perfidious moralism, we might evaluate its development and application of environmental technologies, its proposed and realised reorganisation of settlement, and its efforts to distribute environmental amenity with revived interest. If we understand where our normative assumptions about privacy come from, then they become pliable, if not entirely plastic. In short, we might rekindle the understanding that we have the capacity to design and realise the future. Moreover, insofar as it still conditions our understanding of privacy, the legacy of architecture's historical engagement with social control hinders our capacity to exercise environmental control. We still largely subscribe to a normative conception of housing, with its origins in the bourgeois moralism of the 19th century. Perpetually occupied, individualised, privately owned units with separated, functionally defined spaces. But if we list those values that David Madden and Peter Marcuse suggest are integral with housing in their recent book, In Defence of Housing, shelter, personal safety and ontological security, confirmation of one's agency, cultural identity, individuality, creative powers, the precondition for and control of labour and leisure, the structure of social relationships. Nothing, it seems to me, necessitates the kind of dwelling units, the abundance of space, and the duplication of amenities and material goods from one unit to the next that we currently take for granted. While the proliferation of alternate worlds and experiences is premised on an optimistic cosmopolitan vision, the expansion of the pleasures and heterogeneous interests promised by the metropolis, we're currently running up against the finitude of matter and space. The holistic environmental effects of our uncoordinated assertion of freedom now threaten liberty. If we are to maintain the metropolitan promise, we need to imagine new forms of collective dwelling. From here on out, it's going to increasingly become a question of how we stage and restage, redesign and redesign, denature and denature again, our planetary urbanism. The instruments of communication that we once sought to integrate with our buildings are increasingly disentangled from them. And no doubt, the information gathered from our movements, choices, searches, habits, calendars, and preferences by our menagerie of increasingly intercommunicating things will play a larger part in our future design decisions. But we might imagine that as our wireless infrastructure reaches saturation, as our mobility increases, as we distribute once domesticated functions and objects throughout the city, as our day-to-day activities are increasingly staged contingently, at convenience, in multiple locations, we might chip away at the bourgeois model of private space and begin to imagine ways of living, a distribution of services and goods that leverages our proximity and expands our collective potential. Which is to say, if architecture has been liberated of its vocation of social control, then it might be liberated of the typologies that it invented for the purposes of effecting social control in the first place. Nearly half a century ago, the technologist, futurist, and sometime architect Buckminster Fuller delivered the closing address to the 50th annual convention of the American Planners Association in Washington, D.C., which became Fuller's best-selling book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, of 1969. Our common destiny, Fuller supposed, was the culmination of a journey that had began with what he called the great pirates, the visionary explorers, who, at the turn of modernity, explored the seas and set about reconciling our local experience with the prospect of universal civilization. In the final leg of that journey, Fuller imagined, we would leave the nourishment of our earthly egg behind, and like Nietzschean Superman, leave the planet. In the context of an emerging environmental awareness, Fuller conceived the planet as a vessel, with the sophisticated engineering and ordered social relationships that one associates with successful navigation. In the midst of the counterculture, he argued that as a species we needed to plug in if we were to eventually drop out. If we were to break our earthly bonds, we needed, in short, to run a tight ship. Who's steering the ship is the obvious question. Excessive surveillance and excessive privacy undermine the sense that we're all in the same boat. They trap us below deck. We feel holed up, floating in an exposed underworld, the madness of a ship of fools cast adrift from civilization. But the pervasive reach of surveillance, from orbiting satellites to miniature drones, is a problem that architecture and urbanism can't solve. And the scanning of the world, its processes and its inhabitation, which presents the Anthropocene to us with shocking acuity, nevertheless might lend our designs and reality newfound resolution and salience. So long as we defend islands of mutinous refuge or harbour notions of interplanetary escape, we avoid the issues that confront us. The Earth is our limit. We can treat it like a prison. or together, all refugees in the same boat, we can get organised, ration and cultivate our resources, design our collective freedom, and turn the ship around. Okay, thanks.
We often have a microphone up here. I see we don't, so we're released from that imprisonment, I guess. Scott will entertain any questions. I'll leave it to you to go ahead and handle any questions. So in part of your discussion after the 1970s, you pointed out a number of architectural features in the urban setting, which the view of those outside and inside the restaurant or hotel were the perspectives of the ship. You talked a lot about this would generate new fantasies in a sense for the viewer. But I wonder whose fantasies are being fulfilled here? Is it the architect? Is it the user? Is it the viewer? Is it the voyeur? And it seems to me that the architect is always at root in charge of fantasies. And I don't know if that was the point. You weren't making that point. That's what I think of.
Yeah. Well, there are different kinds of architects. There are certainly there are certainly architects who try to satiate existing fantasies, or the fantasies that are brought to them. But then there's a whole body of thought which talks about the way in which architecture can, if it manufactures fantasies, that those fantasies are in a sense selected by the client taking up their work, if that makes sense. Right, so by selecting that architect as their architect, they're in a sense asking certain architects, right, to or validating those fantasies that those architects imagine.
I guess I still have the problem of that sort of absolves the architect.
Yeah.
The direct fantasies, and yet by the mere construction of what you're doing, you were casting your own, putting your own input.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, no, there's no way. It's not to be avoided. There's no way around it. And so, but that's the basic fundamental socio-political question of architecture is the client. Sometimes you're doing it for the client, and it's the client's fantasies. Sometimes you're doing it on behalf of a democracy, and you're imagining what the world should be. Sometimes there are certain architects who produce fantasies that to attract clients, that then build their fantasies for them. And I don't think there's any way around it.
Your argument is predicated upon that the environment communicates to you, when in fact it's the other way around. The architecture is relatively new, and it requires the intelligence to interpret it to be whatever fantasy you like. So the argument that architecture actually speaks to us is false, because it's much, much more obscure, and the relationship between us and the physical environment is very ambiguous. And therefore, there is much more freedom by the very nature of architecture's presence. And it doesn't exist without you interpreting it. And so it is always you mixing your fantasy with looking at the environment that produces a kind of third fantasy between you and architecture.
Question? Yes.
I wonder, and I'm picking up on this conversation a little bit, I wonder if another lens, I can put another lens in front of you, Scott, which is how models of privacy. In the case of Bentham, similarly, by locating a guard tower in the middle of space, you could produce a model of privacy, or you could kind of reverse that in the case of a hospital like Poitiers or something like that. Anyhow, the tools were very clear there in terms of their relationship to architecture. I wonder if the notion of privacy has slipped off of that relatively concentric relationship relative to architecture in terms of what the discipline can do in the face of it. So, I mean, in other words, what's our relationship to the digital or other forms of information technology that are no longer as bound as, say, a corridor was or an observation point was?
I'm not sure exactly that I'm going to answer your question. I'm not sure I'm following it exactly. Can you, the last bit again? If the,
Does digital surveillance move the question off of architecture?
I guess I'm arguing that the that we can do that at the level of architecture, at the level of the corridor in the room, and I think that's well established. And we used to claim that we could do that also at the level of the city, and that that when it comes to the question of global surveillance, I think it's the urban question and not the architectural question that's the significant one. That, in a sense, it frees us up to not have to construct the space of the street in the way that we thought we had to do in the 19th century. To actually make urbanism work for everybody. And so I guess I'm trying to get to the kind of organizations that we have not in the building, but between buildings or between floors in a building, that I think that's where we're lacking, and also then in the conception of what space we need, right? So that in the context of the digital, maybe we don't need all the stuff that we used to have, or we don't have all the stuff that we used to have, or we don't need to have all the stuff that we used to have, that stuff can be distributed in space in a more collective way that allows us to maybe reduce our private worlds and therefore solve some of the environmental issues of the urban questions. So I think there is a relationship to electronic media in terms of the organization of architecture, now that I'm thinking through the question. And at least the one I've thought of, I think, is that housing doesn't have to be the normative apartment that we imagined, and hence showing the micro-housing, right? That thinking through housing is related to the kinds of collective facilities we have outside of the house as well. Is that getting there?
No, but I'm not sure there's a really good answer to my question.
Okay.
That was a delightful lecture to listen to, so thank you, first of all. But I was intrigued by your bring up price funds. I think that it's, I appreciate your optimism in the idea that the shrinking of the domestic will produce a collective. But that's part of what he addressed too in that novel was that the retreat, so that Des sits in his armchair and just travels by reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so isn't there the similar possibility of all of us retreating in our own little private worlds, even if they're very small, precisely because of the advent of the digital and the possibility of not producing that collective? And it's sort of interesting to note that Welbeck's book, Submission, looks at Weissmann as his topic, so the protagonist is looking precisely going back to that very character.
Right. I wonder if, so that's one way to present it, say. I wonder if another way to present it isn't that, say, the kinds of stuff you see in the Nouvelle Hotel, in the sense that media becomes a kind of expansion of space and expands our conceptual experiences of architecture, might actually, I think you could look at it in a positive sense and say it actually allows the restriction of space, right? So yes, that actually might be what saves us in the end, but I don't know that it might be in a sense that's a lament for public space in terms of architecture, in terms of urbanism, But it's not a lament, but it's not a loss of collectivity in terms of the virtual world. And so it may be that we actually have to give up on public space. You know, to actually make the, to make the,
But I don't think your argument was quite that specific. You're giving us, you know, you were saying surveillance and relative freedom, independent freedom. That's often cast as freedom and security politically. Right? Do you want freedom or do you want security? Are you giving away all your freedom by feeling safe? It's the same thing, I think, it's a slightly larger framework around which you're thinking about it. And the argument you made from Evans was that a wall is not freedom or security or freedom and or surveillance, but it's and.
it's what, sorry?
And. It's freedom and surveillance. It's freedom and security, right? It never functions as one or the other. And that we have always consistently defaulted to, oftentimes, seemingly, to the side of its surveillance, its security, and that despite the fact that the walls that we make can be read either way, we're only falling on one side, right? It's like, you know, the good fences make good neighbors, right? That is the ambiguity of the wall that allows it to both enhance freedom and enhance security at the same time. So it's not an either-or proposition. What was interesting about what you said is, and maybe I'm overinterpreting it, is that our electronic devices taking over so much of what we used to do with walls and spaces in terms of providing security and in terms of providing surveillance has allowed us, because of these electronic inventions, we have an opportunity to exercise more freely both parts, both sides of freedom and surveillance. That is not, we're not necessarily going to fall always individually into the side of surveillance or over caution or security. But because those are no longer controlled in physical space, they're controlled digitally and virtually, we are now more free to interpret these elements like the wall as both freedom and security, right? That we don't fall, we don't have to succumb to that single reading that always means that walls exclude. Or we do less so because walls have now been relinquished from their obligations, those secure obligations, those targeting obligations, and opening up a broader possibility of collectivity because of that. Is that an oversimplification of your
That sounds pretty good. I'll take that.
of your argument? And I think it talks to Sarah's question, which is we're one tendency is to think we're just getting more and more and more isolated, more and more bubbled, and more secure, and more surveilled in our little electronic worlds. Lots of evidence for that. But it also suggests that because this surveillance, because these activities have been taken over by the electronic, by the virtual realm, that the wall is much more free to be interpreted. We're much more free to interpret walls as inclusion, right? It's not just exclusionary, but inclusionary. So the party wall in the city is not this thing that we have to hold around ourselves to maintain our integrity. We get
Sorry.
that digitally. And you're talking about urbanism, that could fall out of that. We just get out of this stupid grind of always thinking about
invite all of you out to small reception, and you can pick Scout's brains some more. So thank you very much, Scout.
Thank you.